Welcome, everybody. This seminar, we're talking about the tips for identifying when job wait times can be reduced by job submission parameter changes. So I spend a lot of my time as a high-performance computing consultant dealing with the scheduler on the general purpose systems of the Compute Canada clusters. One of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is helping researchers who have support requests about unexpected wait times. And what we've been working on in the background as staff is a way of identifying unexpected wait times for jobs on the clusters. And we've started creating alerts for these. And what I've been doing as part of my day-to-day is going over this ranked list of accounts that are experiencing unusual wait times, and then seeing if there's something that we can do to provide a solution to those wait times. Now, we're working on things, actually, policies for increasing the priority if there doesn't seem to be anything else we can do. But so far, the majority of the time while I'm doing this, we can find a way to resubmit the jobs so that they have access to a lot more resources and are able to start much more quickly and actually have more throughput. So I've been doing this for a couple of years with the scheduler team, just responding to support requests. But now that we're actively flagging and preemptively contacting users, I've had a lot of opportunity to get a process down. As well, the lead of the scheduling national team has built a tool on the clusters that is very valuable for helping make these decisions. So what I'm going to go through today, I'll just get started now, is I'm going to talk about this ranking of accounts by wait time pane. So wait time is a thing that has to happen on the clusters. These clusters are totally saturated with jobs, and wait time is the only thing that the scheduler can use to try and establish the fair usage across researchers. But there are some type of pains that are unexpected for wait times, and I'm just going to describe that wait time pane. Some of the important things to interpret whenever we're trying to understand so the main thing that we're worried about is the wait time pane. Whenever there's wait time that we aren't really expecting. So some of the main things that we have to consider are the heterogeneity of the general purpose cluster nodes. This means that there's a lot of different types of nodes on the system. And what happens with different types of nodes is that whenever you submit a job that ends up being only able to run on a very specific type of node, then you might be unnecessarily reducing the amount of resources that the job can run on. And that's where you get the highest impact on the wait time. The other thing is that nodes are organized into partitions. And understanding the layout of the partitions also can drastically change the number of resources that a job will have access to run on. So we'll be looking at some of that. So both of these things can feel kind of hidden. So how many nodes there are of a specific type with certain hardware on them versus how many nodes belong to a certain partition and what the job properties of that partition are. These things are kind of hidden, but they have huge impact on wait time sometimes. So what I want to talk about today is going over an example of specifically viewing the system's partitioning. So we're going to be looking at the partition stats function call on a system. And then also we're going to be viewing another sort of the view of what resources are available on those nodes by partition using a function called cluster stats. Okay, so those two functions will allow us to see the properties or the snapshots of the state of the system and how many resources are available to certain job types. Now, the next thing that we want to be able to explore, we want to be able to examine the job parameters. And importantly, we want to know how these parameters relate to the partitions. So what job parameters will impact the partition that a job will have access to? And then basically the partition determines how many resources that job has access to. So we're going to take a look at a case study where an account has a bunch of different job types and they end up in different partitions. And then what I will do is I will then go onto the cluster, and then I will start submitting my own jobs, trying to dictate where it'll end up and see if I can increase the number of resources that that job will have access to. And then take a look at what the impact of that would be on the wait time. What we're really looking at is the usage of an account over time. So I want to describe what it is for an account to be experiencing pain. The drawing that I have up at the top here is a representation of, over time for a single account. Each one of these objects here is a job. So we'll just this is like a close-up of a bunch of jobs there. The gray area corresponds to the wait time of a job. The green area corresponds to the runtime of a job. And then the extra part at the end is basically the over requested time. Okay. Now, the usage of an account on the general purpose systems is measured by how many jobs were actually had allocated resources there. So I'm just going to tell you, I keep saying allocation at the top here, that whenever you request resources for a job and that job starts on the system, because no other user can use the resources that are allocated to that job, that's considered the account's usage. And that's what is billed towards the fair share. The other thing that we can do, though, is because all of those jobs have a known wait time through the job records, we can actually measure how many resources an account has waiting by stacking up all of the jobs that had a submit time in the past and a start time in the future, and then summing up the amount of resources that were in each of those jobs. So what I want to do is describe to you specifically what it is that staff have started flagging in the background. So the figure down below here is a time series that translates the amount of waiting resources into this light blue line here. So during this period, that is up here, this account had a lot of resources waiting in the queue for quite a while. That's the light blue line. The dark blue line is how many resources were actually running at that time. Okay? So what we have is a time series that identifies how much the account has pending in the queue and how much it's running at any time. Now, importantly, there's also this gray area. That gray area corresponds to the amount of throughput that the scheduler is trying to maintain for that account. So basically, regardless of how much is queued, the scheduler is going to try and keep the blue line oscillating around the gray line. That's how the scheduler is able to achieve fair usage across systems. Now, this means that sometimes wait times are not unexpected. If you submit a huge amount of resources that are way beyond the expected throughput of an account, there's likely going to be wait time. But we understand that researchers, do work sporadically and need to have bursts of usage in order to do their research, not just a constant throughput. So what ends up happening is accounts end up in different states. what we have down in the bottom panel now is this dark blue line that we have here is converted into the cumulative sum. So over time, it's just the cumulative usage along here. The gray area corresponds to the cumulative sum of the target. Now, that means that there are times when the cumulative usage is above the cumulative target. That's whenever an account will have low priority and can expect to have wait times. But there are also times when the cumulative usage is below the target share for different reasons. And these are the times that we would like the accounts to be able to catch up to their target share. So those are periods of time where the slope of the usage will be higher than the target share. So we see this burst usage. Okay. Now, the pain metric that we are specifically identifying whenever we are alerting in our monitors are situations like this right here, where the account is currently below the target share. It has a lot waiting in the queue, and it has very little running at the time. That deviation is what we identify as a potential problem, either with the scheduler configuration or the research load trying to achieve something that is difficult to do, and oftentimes can be changed through job submission parameters. Now, these are the wait times that we're very concerned about, and we're trying to minimize across all users on the system. So what we end up having is basically, I'll just give you, this is a quick summary that identifies how far any account is from its target share. And then we have these plots that show all of the accounts on a system. And basically, whenever their gray circles are below the 0 line far enough, this is how we prioritize the accounts that we're doing the assessment on. Now, what I want to talk about today is how we do that assessment. So the first thing to consider whenever we identify an account that doesn't seem to be achieving its potential throughput on the clusters and experiencing wait times is we want to understand the characteristics of the nodes on the system. The other thing is that the general purpose systems have different node structures, different types of nodes, and oftentimes it's just a matter of switching the system that you're running on. So here I have a view of the Graham table at the Compute Canada wiki, and what we have here is a layout of all the different node types. So the first type of node that I think we should call the base nodes, there are 903 of them. Each one of those nodes has 32 cores and about 128 gigs of memory. And these are the major parameters that we're going to be looking at whenever we're trying to assess this. We'll notice that there are also very different types of nodes. We have these, a very small number, 3 nodes, where each node has 64 cores, but has about 3 terabytes of memory. So here already we can see, if you're requesting 3 terabytes of memory, your wait time is going to be dramatically longer, likely, than if you're requesting 128 gigs, because at 128 gigs, you have access to 903 nodes, whereas at 3 terabytes, you have access to 3 nodes. So that is a very dramatic difference in the memory request. And the problem is that there are far more subtle differences in job shape that have a very similar impact on the number of nodes that a job has access to. So the first thing to know is basically what types of nodes are available, and can you submit jobs that best match a specific node type on a cluster. The next thing is that nodes, so a job is submitted to the scheduler, and then the scheduling software is monitoring all the cluster to identify when that job can get allocated to nodes. The thing is that jobs don't have access to all of the nodes all of the time. The system is divided into partitions. So this image here is basically each square corresponds to a node. So here's a single node, and we'll call that the base node. There are also a smaller subset of medium memory nodes. There's a smaller subset of large memory nodes. And then there's another subset of nodes like GPU nodes that have different hardware components. Okay. So here we see the actual division of the number of nodes by the hardware parameters that are in there. But there's another layer of division here that corresponds to job properties. So the first one I have here, I just say it's 3 hours. This 3-hour thing is basically saying that all of these nodes will accept jobs that are 3 hours runtime or less. Now, it's possible that we'll have a smaller subset at 12 hours and then 1 day. But currently, actually, the 1 day partition, that subset of nodes, is actually the same as the 3-hour. Okay? Now, the important part here is that the partition that is identified with a maximum runtime reduces the number of nodes that a job will have access to based on how long of a time limit it's requesting. This is more of an issue once you go beyond 1 day. So for example, if you request more than 3 days, you get access to a subset. If you request 7 days, you get access to a subset. And then some of the systems, you can even request a 28-day runtime. And then you are heavily restricting yourself to a very small subset of nodes. For example, the 28 days just has this very small partition. Now, this layout of the subsets of nodes that are available by runtime isn't an accurate representation of the systems, but what I'm going to do later is show you how to get the actual picture of the number of nodes that are available by partition. So the way it's set up is that the amount of runtime that you request reduces the amount of nodes that you have access to. There's basically a 1 day, 3, it might even be a 4 day, a 7 day, and a 28 day criteria for the different partition types. Another thing, though, is that there is also this by core or by node differentiation. The general purpose systems currently prefer jobs that request an entire node or multiple entire nodes for themselves. This is referred to as by node partition. So if you're requesting just part of a node, or you're requesting part of multiple nodes, you actually have access to a smaller set of nodes to run on. Now, this, right, and then there's backfill. So anything that's submitted for under 1 day then get access to run on any node that doesn't already have something scheduled there. So depending on how you submit a job, you will gain access to different resources. Here's a simple example where you can submit a job with 32 tasks. So that's how many cores are on a typical node. and then specify a single node. So this blue job can either end up taking up one full node, and this is out in the by node partition, or it could take up a full node in here that also overlaps with the by core partition. All of these nodes overlap in terms of the nodes that they belong to. Now, the alternative is you can specify the same parameters, the same 3 days. So all of these jobs are shown as in the 3-day partition. And you can specify the number of tasks without specifying the number of nodes. And then that job can end up distributing itself across several partial nodes. That job getting distributed across multiple nodes forces it to stay within the by core partition node set. Okay, so this same job that's requesting 32 cores and 3 days can increase the number of nodes it has access to by simply requesting that all 32 of those cores be exclusive on a single node. That is one of the first ways of increasing the number of resources that a job has access to. And then in this case, you could also see that if you're able to reduce the runtime below 1 day, you would also get access to several more nodes that are here. What we want to know now is whenever you're on the cluster and you're submitting jobs, how do we see those states of the system? So in order to view a snapshot of the partitioning state on a cluster, so this will show you both how the current cluster is partitioned in its configuration, as well as some snapshot details about the load that is in the different partitions. So here, once I'm logged into a cluster, I can call a function called partition stats, and it will give me this output. So this output is divided where we have a 3-hour partition, a 12-hour partition, a 24-hour partition, and then this is the 28-day partition. Then we have the numbers in the by node partition versus the by core divided by the colon. So if I look at the total number of node table at the very bottom, I see that whenever this snapshot was taken, if I were to submit a job for a runtime less than 24 hours in by core, so it could run on partial cores, I would have access to 626 nodes. But if I change that job to request all of the cores on a single node and use up a whole node, I would almost double the number of nodes that I would have access to 1058. Right? Now, the other thing that we can see in these snapshots is you can see here the number of queued jobs by those different parameter sets, the number of current running ones, and then even the number of idle ones. And this is something we monitor to make sure they aren't idle. And in this case, idle often means that those nodes are just waiting for a large job to start. Okay. Now, the next thing, and this is the tool that was developed by the lead of the scheduler national team, is we can also look at a breakdown where a partition actually contains multiple different types of nodes. So in this case, if we say the under 1 day job, there's a total of 20,000 cores, this is nodes at the time, but that's actually broken down into a heterogeneous set of nodes where some of those nodes have 32 cores per node, and others have 44. And they each have different amount of memory. This is a very important property because this is saying that if I were to submit a job requesting 32 cores but 210 gigs of memory, I would lose access to all of those. So I would actually lose access to the largest number. And I would also, with 210 gigs, lose access to all of these nodes, which is a large number, and I would only maintain access to this subset of nodes. Now, that difference between submitting a job at 210 gigs per node and 190 gigs per node is something that's often feasible. Now, what we need to know here is that by using this cluster stats program on any of the clusters, we can identify not only how many nodes or cores are in a partition, but also the different types of hardware that are available inside of each of those partitions. Okay, so the next thing is understanding what the job parameters are of a set of jobs that are experiencing the pain. So typically whenever I get a notification that there are accounts that have unusually high weight pain, what I'll do is I'll go onto the cluster where these accounts are experiencing the pain, and on that system, I will call the sact command with a specific set of parameters. So the sact command will give me information about an account, and I can list jobs. So in this case, I'm basically saying I'm listing all of the jobs for a specific account. That's my default account there. And then I'm basically saying, since a certain time. And then I'm getting it to tell me the number of CPUs per job, the number of nodes, the requested memory, the time limit, and then the partition. And then I'm specifying that I want to make sure that there are a lot of characters. There's 36 characters in the column for the partition, because I want to be able to tell if that job can belong to multiple partitions. So then the output of saccount is a table that starts with job IDs, then the number of CPUs, number of nodes, the requested memory, the time limit, and then the actual partition that it belonged to. And this is where we can relate that job back to the distribution of resources available by node. Okay, so the next thing, we want to not only understand what we asked for, but in past jobs, we want to see what was actually used. So this is why I was referring to the job usage as allocation. What we want to know is not only what the job requested. So in this case, it was requesting a time limit of 4 days. And it was requesting 32 cores, it was requesting 1 node, and it was requesting 7,000 megs per core. So this is 7 gigs per core, 32, something like somewhere near 250 gigs per node in that case. So what we want to see is, because we know that the time limit has a substantial effect on the number of nodes that a job has access to, we want to know if completed jobs in the past really needed that much time. And what we can see for this case, that all of these jobs actually completed within 8 hours. So these jobs could have been submitted as 12-hour jobs. And whenever we were looking at the partitioning, this B5 basically means that it's, the fifth longest out of 6 partitions, which dramatically reduces the number of cores that are available. So once we get a history of how much time is actually needed, it's definitely the case that we should change the requested time of jobs that don't need as much time as they're requesting. Now, comparing the elapsed time to the time limit is a very accurate and precise measurement. We know exactly how much time jobs are requesting. And we also know how long they ran from their start and end time. What's a little bit more difficult to view in the scheduler, but there is some hint of it, is a record of the max RSS. So you'll note that in this bottom one here, so basically the concern is these jobs here that were submitted on November 24th and didn't run till December 3rd or 4th. So that was the wait time that triggered the alert. So I'll call sact again, and then this time I actually remove the X that I had up there. That says, show me the properties of the steps within each of the jobs. So these two jobs here, I've shown in multiple steps down here. Then I've added the max RSS to the output. And I can see that although these jobs were requesting the 210 gigs per core, they were actually only using under 150 gigs per node. Okay? This means that this request could be reduced down substantially in terms of its memory set. And whenever we're looking at the properties on the system, we actually saw that there is basically a cutoff at 190 gigs, where there were substantially more nodes available to run at that size of memory. So cutting these down from what is 210 gigs down below 190 would be a drastic change, even though the process that's running in that job will not have any idea that that change occurred. So because the job doesn't run for more than 6 hours, it will have no idea that we've changed the time limit from 5 days down to 12 hours because it never reaches that point. If we change the total memory request from 210 gigs down to 190 even, because the memory consumption never reaches that, it will have no idea that we've reduced the size of that resource. But those parameter changes will dramatically affect the number of nodes that this job has access to, and then having the impact on starting as quickly as possible. The other thing that we can see, and this is probably part of the confusion that happened with these jobs, is that the requested time was 5 days. The actual elapsed time of the jobs when they ran was under 7 hours. But if you look at the average CPU, it's up at 6 days. So that's basically the number of cores times their percentage of activity over the period. So I think if all of the cores, if all 30 cores were running for 7 hours, that would be something like 8 days. But importantly, the time limit relates only to the elapsed wall time, not to the actual CPU time of the system. So here we can see that it's actually using a lot of its CPU, and that number of CPUs is probably fine. But here we could actually get a snapshot to see if we could also reduce the number of CPUs that are required for that job type. Okay, so that's looking at the job states and some of the high-level utilization metrics that we have in there. And then, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go onto the cluster here. So I'm going to go onto Cedar, and I'm actually going to replicate this issue. So I'm going to try and run a job that is requesting those parameters, and then use partition stats and cluster stats to view how much of a difference I can make in the number of resources that that job is allowed to run on. Right? And we'll take a look at some of the system properties while we're doing that. So I'm just going to log into Cedar here, and this is, so I'm going to log into Cedar, and so on Cedar, I run jobs from my Scratch directory. I've got this demo folder, and then I have this Hello World demo. Okay, so in this folder, what I have is I have this little Hello World program that I'm just going to use as an example of a process that I'm going to run. So it's basically just a Hello World. And then what I have is a bunch of submission scripts that, first of all, replicate those problematic jobs that I saw in that case study of an account that was experiencing pain. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to submit this job, and I'm going to see if I can get it into the same partition state that the other one was in. So if I take a quick look at this job submission script, I see that, like we saw in that job, it's requesting a 5-day runtime limit. The memory per CPU is 7,000 megs. And then the CPUs per task, so this is a threaded job, was 30. And then it's going to save its output there. So all that I'm going to do initially is I'm just going to submit this job using sbatch to my default account. And then this is the threaded submit script. Okay, so now I have my job ID. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at what that looks like from SAC's point of view. And what I get is, sorry. So what I get is this job 21710,756 is the job that is the last one that I submitted. 5 days, 30 cores, a single node. And then we see that it is sitting in the bi-core partition, which we know is a small subset of the bi-node partitions. And then B5 corresponds to the greater than 4 days. So that job replicates the case study that I was looking at. What I want to do now is just take a quick look at partition stats. And partition stats goes through and it pulls a bunch of information about the configuration on the cluster, the types of nodes, and the partitions that they belong on, and basically the load of jobs that are in the various partitions. So what we'll see whenever partition stats comes up is, given that I now know which partition this job belongs to, I can explore how many nodes exist in that partition, and potentially how many are available for this job to run. Okay, there we go. So the B5 name at the end of the partition name corresponds to the time window. So this is B1, B2. This is the B1, B2, B3, B4, and then this is the B5. So if I look down at the bottom, in terms of the total number of nodes available. Maybe I'll just make this a bit smaller. So in the by-core partition, the total number of nodes that I would have access to is 827 nodes. If I were to submit that requesting a full node, there would be 1,049. And then if I also knew that I could submit that for under a day, I would have access to over 1,700 nodes. Now, the number of nodes that a job has access to directly relates to the amount of time that it waits in the queue. Now, the problem is that of this 1773 that I've been looking at, I don't know how many of those nodes actually have enough memory to run the job that we were designing whenever we were looking at all of the over asking on the system. Now, what I can do to find that out is I can call cluster stats. Cluster stats goes and it pulls the system and it finds information about the partitioning and about jobs, but it also notes the different node types that are within each of the partitions. So it will hold this in cache and it'll be waiting here with enough information in memory to do the exploration that we're looking at. Now, from here, what I can do is I can look into, basically just use the up and down arrows, and I'm going to select a view of the cluster. And what I'm interested in are CPU jobs that are requesting less than 12 gigabytes per memory. So I'll just pull that. And then I'm going to differentiate that I'm looking at jobs that allow for partial nodes. Okay? And what I want to do is look at the number of cores that are available with the memory. So this is now a similar summary to what we were looking at in partition stats, only for the by-core partition. And then here we have that 3 to 7 day window. So the total number of cores that are available to that job is 30,992. But we see that there's actually different node types in here. And specifically, the only node type that could run that job if it was requesting 210 gigs is that small subset of 992 cores, which is not that many nodes. Okay, so if I then take a look at the different node configurations here, I see that there is actually a node type that has 48 cores and 192 gigs of memory. And that subset has over 20,000 cores available to it. And that's still just in the by-core partition. So let's remember, at this point, that job that I submitted has access to 992 cores. But if I make the recommended changes that I was talking about before, so I'm just going to go back, I'm going to look at this cluster, this is base memory, and then I want to look at if I submitted this to by node, I get this new table. I found out that I could actually submit this job based on the job properties, that I could submit this job for under 12 hours. I could submit it by node, let's say, and then I could submit it with 48 cores and have it run with under 192 gigs. Okay. With that combination, I actually gain access to 63,000 cores rather than the 992 that I have in my original submission. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically change my parameters. So I'm going to quick out of cluster stats, and then I'm going to take a look at submitting another job. That's whenever I basically tell it to go to by node. Actually, I'll just take a quick look at what's in here. So by node, and then I think memory was next, and then time. So all that I've changed is I've specified a more appropriate time limit. You know, in fact, I'm gonna change this even lower because 1 day is still too much. I'm going to change this down to 12 hours, and then I can submit it with 4 gigs per CPU. And then the number of CPUs per task, I can even up to 48 CPUs. So actually increasing the number of cores while also increasing the number of nodes that it belongs to. So I will save this, yes. And then I will just submit this job. So to submit this one, there. So in fact, the process that runs inside of those jobs will have very little idea that anything changed. So the process itself will actually get access to more cores in this case, which, you know, and the billing might not even change because the memory was also reduced. It will run for a shorter amount of time, but we know that these jobs complete well within the window. And right, and then they're all of those cores, we're just making sure that it's happening exclusively and taking over an entire node. Oh, got a timeout. Okay. So got a timeout from the scheduler. I'll just try and resubmit it. And then I'll just go over the summary and then you can ask questions. So in summary, what I want to get across is that a saturated system like the general purpose systems of the Compute Canada environment, those systems will have wait times, and those wait times are required to distribute the usage according to the fair share principles. But some of those wait times are extended because the type of job isolated itself to a more scarce type of resource, either because of the hardware in the nodes or because of the way that the system is partitioned. So it's important that understanding the types and the quantities of nodes can help in designing job submissions for maximum resource access, as well as understanding the distribution on nodes or of nodes across partitions and how the job shape will impact the number of resources the job has access to. So that job got submitted. I'm just going to do my SQ again. And I think we found that if I changed the job, so my first submission requested 5 days, 30 cores on a single node and ended up in the bi-core B5. Now, because I reduced it down to 12 hours and then 48 cores, this ended up on what's called a binode partition in the B1, which is the most abundant time partition, but it is also capable of running in 2 backfill partitions, which basically has access to almost the entire cluster. And what we'll see is likely if we keep eyeballing these, that these second jobs that have access to more resources will start substantially sooner, even though the process is identical inside. And that's all. We can open it up for questions.